Hello again, welcome back. Today we're going to combine two chapters, chapter 38, which is research involving women, and chapter 42, which is research with children. We're going to combine them into one lecture. So I hope you find this efficient and good. So before we start, because I love scandals, actually I only like scandals in fiction. So these are some really sad stories that we have that sort of gives us the framework and a very brief recent history of things that have happened with women in medical care and research that influence how we treat women today. So we have some scandals to talk about. We've already talked about thalidomide, right? And so the introduction of thalidomide without consent in research, and then the risks involved with thalidomide, because we know thalidomide is a drug that prevents formation of new blood vessels. So lots of disfiguring birth defects with thalidomide. Now, the United States does not have a corner market, a corner on the market for research problems with women. So this is an interesting one. We haven't talked about it before. National Women's Hospital of New Zealand. And so this came about when pap smears were really starting to become widely accepted. And pap smears are now done routinely as a screening tool to determine cervical cancer. And so because this was a relatively new test, there was a study being done to determine whether using the pap smear was actually could determine and diagnose cases of cervical cancer. And so looking at really how effective this screening tool was. And so that all sounds good and appropriate and helpful, but one of the lead physicians on the study decided that the treatment for cervical cancer, which is hysterectomy, would not be ideal for women. He determined that women gained a lot of their identity by having uterus, and that women would not want to let go of that identifying organ and their ability to have children. And so he made a decision for women that a lot of their central characteristics were, placed in this childbearing capacity. And so he did not tell people, did not tell women when they had positive pap smears. And so a lot of women died unnecessarily as a result of this study. And it wasn't actually stopped until 1984, which really, when you think about it, wasn't all that long ago. Then there's the Dalkon Shield. The Dalkon Shield was one of the very first intrauterine devices to prevent pregnancy. Unfortunately, women who used the Dalkon Shield were at a 5 times increased risk of pelvic inflammatory disease and pregnancy problems. And so it was eventually pulled off the market, but millions of women were exposed to unnecessary risk. So this started getting people very interested in protecting women. Along that time, so we've thought of women as a group to protect. They're very vulnerable. But in 1973, this was and I think everybody's heard of this case, Roe versus Wade. And Roe v. Wade was the case that allowed abortion laws to be put into place in the United States. So it wasn't until 1973 that abortions were legal in this country. And we're not going to get into the debate, the moral debate about abortion, but this is a very important thing, because now this is the very first case that allows women to sort of make a lot of decisions for their health. And so it starts to shift the thinking away from women are very vulnerable, weak creatures that need to be protected, and to now allowing women to make a lot of decisions for their health. The 1977 FDA guideline 773040 was sort of still very much a protectionist concept. So this guideline said that women could not participate in phase 1 or phase 2 trials if they were pregnant. Excuse me, not if they were pregnant, just if they had childbearing capacity. So if they were fertile, they were not allowed to participate in any trials. And it was very restrictive. So this guideline said basically if you can have a baby, you cannot participate in a clinical trial, which wiped out a significant portion of adult women who could participate in clinical trials otherwise. The good news is it did take a while. 1993, the NIH Revitalization Act reversed this. So we no longer restrict women with childbearing capacity from participating in clinical research. Then there was the 1978 Pregnancy Discrimination Act. And the Pregnancy Discrimination Act wasn't necessarily about clinical research, but this basically said you cannot discriminate against women if they are pregnant. So up until this time, you know, women could be turned down for jobs or promotions just based on the fact that they were carrying a baby. And so in 1978, they started saying that pregnant women are a special class that cannot be discriminated against. And then in 1985, there was a public task force on women's health issues. And this task force really was focused on women's health issues, and so it did involve clinical research as well, because really prohibiting, especially in the 1977 FDA guideline, prohibiting women of childbearing capacity from participating in clinical research really stymied the data that was available on women of childbearing capacity. So this task force said, excuse me, there are women's health issues that have not been adequately studied as a result, and we're going to have to take a look at those. So that gives you a little bit of background on some things that happened and why we treat women the way we do, to some degree historically speaking. So here are some questions central and very important in our clinical research involving women's health care. So the first one, what is the best balance of inclusion? So being open to women, making sure that women participate in clinical research, but at the same time protecting them. So some people say you should have women in clinical research trials because women should share the burden of research. Remember, we talked before about justice, and it is unfair and it is ethically incorrect to ask one group to share the burdens and the risks associated with clinical trials for the benefit of a whole larger group. And so we are saying, in this case, that the proponent's saying that the women should be in clinical research, and I think you just found out there that I'm a proponent of women in clinical research, is that women should share the burden of research for purposes of justice. Also, the gender-specific research is needed. Men and women are different. Physiologically, we're different, and so there is a specific need for research on women. You cannot say that the research that you performed on a man is the same and that the findings can be applied to women. We know this for a fact from things like some famous research that has been done about heart attacks and cardiovascular risk. Estrogen has a protective benefit for women's hearts, and so women have heart attacks. They start having heart attacks a little bit later in life than men. And when women do have heart attacks, clinically their presentation is very different from men. So there is really a specific need for research in each gender. So some detractors say, well, maybe you shouldn't have women in clinical research because maybe some of those risks will be transferred to future generations. Maybe some therapeutic drugs have the ability to have epigenetic impact. In other words, that woman might not be pregnant while in the trial, but maybe some of those risks that she's been exposed will be passed on to her children. So that's definitely a worry. And some people say it increases the research costs. And if you've learned anything from CLST 1371, I hope that you realize that research costs are very, very important to consider, because the more expensive it is to develop a drug, the less likely it is that that drug will ever make it to market. So some people say that making sure that you have women in clinical trials can extend the time it takes to enroll patients, and therefore it increases the costs. I argue that even if that's true, although I have not found any data to say that that actually happens, if it is true, it would probably still be worth it. Another question, is it appropriate to classify women as vulnerable? And I think this is a very good question, because when we talk about groups that are vulnerable, we talk about protecting them to make sure people can't take advantage of them. And so the question gets to be, are women vulnerable? So to be vulnerable And the definition out of our book is those who are relatively or absolutely incapable of protecting their own interests. So, I think in this respect, if we were to use the definition here of vulnerable, I would argue that women are not relatively or absolutely incapable of protecting their own interest. I think women are as capable as men. Again, of course, I have a bias because I'm a woman, but I don't think that there's necessarily anything inherent about being female that makes me incapable of protecting my own interest. However, another definition, your standard dictionary definition, is one who's capable or susceptible of being wounded or hurt. And I guess in that respect, women do have physical size differences oftentimes. And so, physically speaking, I guess you could say a woman is vulnerable, but I don't know that necessarily being female increases the risk of being wounded or hurt in a clinical trial. Unless, of course, you're worrying about reproductive capability, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Another question, are there unique circumstances in which women should be considered vulnerable? I just basically made an argument that I don't find them to be vulnerable, just based only on gender alone. But there can be some considerations, and we'll get into those in a second. Here we go. The pregnant participant. Is a pregnant participant, therefore, a little more vulnerable? And some could make a little bit of a better argument that pregnancy creates vulnerability. Mothers, as they carry children, are uniquely aware of the sort of the liability of carrying a child. And you could also look about vulnerability in terms of reproductive potential. But the interesting thing about the pregnant participant isn't just that we are talking about one person here. This becomes a much more complicated scenario in clinical research because we're really talking about a three-pronged approach here. There are three distinct individuals that have to be considered. The fetus has to be considered. There is an inherent, some people argue, that there's an inherent maternal-fetal conflict of interest. And whose needs are more important than the others? Some argue that they're equally important because they're both living beings. But there does become a conflict of interest inherent just because there are two different beings there. The fetus does have the right to protection from harm in some situations and under some laws. But the maternal rights, so the rights of the mother to autonomy, self-agency, and justice also come about. This is going to get a little complicated. And then there are some ethicists that discuss making decisions about the pregnant participant, the mother-fetus conflict in terms of something called dependent moral status. And that basically says that the fetus, the moral status of the fetus is dependent upon the mother. And it's dependent upon the mother to maintain that pregnancy, and that when that child is born, then they have their own independent moral status. So there are lots of different ways we can sort of look at this pregnant participant. And then the last one is through the lens of the father. So in terms of clinical research, the father does have a say in consent. So for non-therapeutic research, the father must consent. The law does allow some exceptions if the father's whereabouts are not known, some things like that. But otherwise, if there's a father involved with the mother and is aware of the pregnancy, the father does also have to consent for research in cases when it's non-therapeutic and there's risk involved. Now, the mother does get to trump the father in cases of direct benefit or minimal risk. So, minimal risk, the dad cannot vote against it, essentially. The mom gets to decide if there is minimal risk, and the mom gets to decide if there's a likelihood of direct benefit to her, the fetus, or both of them. Now, what makes this complicated is that paternal rights are secondary to maternal rights in abortion laws. So we have sort of two standards here. We have a standard for the father having decision-making input in terms of clinical research, but in terms of abortion laws, the father does not have the rights that can supersede the mother. So some questions regarding pregnant participants is, are the IRBs best suited to weigh the welfare of the mother against that of the fetus? Because this is a question that comes about when the IRB reviews and eventually, assumingly approves research. The IRB gets to weigh in on this. Another good question is, how can society reconcile abortion rights laws and the paternal position of federal research laws? So, dads don't have any say in abortion rights, in abortion laws. They don't have any rights. But however, the fathers do have rights when it comes to clinical research. So we have some conflict there that has not been reconciled. So the dad's rights are not across the board in all situations. And then the next question is, should men of childbearing ability have similar restrictions when exposed to investigational drugs? So back in 1993, when we said women with childbearing capacity should have the right to share the burden of clinical research, there are lots of languages and protocols. If you haven't participated in your internship yet, you will see that there's going to be language about making sure that woman of childbearing ability does not become pregnant while she's being exposed to an investigational drug. Rarely do we have restrictions on men that say the same thing. An exception would be for some drugs that we know affect sperm. But by and large, men are allowed to participate in clinical research without restrictions on their childbearing ability. So there's a little bit of inequity there. So women are asked to refrain from pregnancy, while men are not necessarily asked to do the same. So let's talk a little bit about pediatric data and the need for pediatric research. So it is thoroughly understood in the pediatric community that we have big deficits in the current knowledge regarding many therapeutic drugs for children. So a lot of the drugs that are used now, the data is often derived from adult studies. So if there was a clinical trial and a drug is approved based on many clinical trials, sometimes those findings are extrapolated and sort of applied to children. But children are not just small adults. Children have different physiological needs, and children's bodies do not behave like adult bodies. Eventually they become adult bodies, but we know that you cannot just simply apply adult data to children. It doesn't work that way. So there's a real need for pediatric studies. So let's talk about some acceptable pediatric research in terms of risk and benefit. The very first one is minimal risk. So what is minimal risk? Minimal risk is the risk that would be inherent in everyday life. Right, because you have risk. You could have an untied shoelace and trip and bruise your knee. That's minimal risk. That is just part of being on the planet. Minimal risk is okay whether or not you believe there will be direct benefit. The next one is risks exist but are minimized and justified, and these would be okay in the presence of the prospect of direct benefit. So when we say risks exist, we're going to say that that's more than minimal. And the study is designed so that the risks are avoided as much as possible. And also that the data that's going to be collected justifies the risks. So that there is a very compelling scientific question that is going to be answered with the data, and that therefore justifies the risk. Now, risk that is greater than minimal risk, but it only represents a minor bump over minimal risk, is okay. One, if they're in the presence of no likelihood of direct benefit, and also that study procedures are similar, so the procedures in the protocol are very similar to the ones in medical care. And two parts to this: research is likely to produce information of vital importance. So you can expose someone to more than minimal risk, even if there's no prospect of direct benefit. assuming that the study procedures are not really much different than medical care, and that you're answering a very important research question. So those are the three sort of acceptable categories of pediatric research. There is a fourth category that is very rare, but it is sort of a blanket statement that is in federal law that allows research that does not otherwise qualify, so it doesn't meet any of those three criteria, but is undertaken to understand, prevent, or alleviate a serious health condition. And this can only be done on approval from the Department of Health and Human Services. So the DHS is the only one that can approve this, and it requires input from the community. It requires expert testimony. So you can see why this is going to be very rare. So the National Commission on Pediatric Research came about and made some recommendations, and these were the criteria that this commission, said that IRBs must consider. IRBs must determine that pediatric research is scientifically sound, and that was one of the things I mentioned in the earlier slides. So that it is scientifically sound question, so that you have a goal in mind that is going to provide data for a very important question. That animal, adult, and older children research must be done prior to infants when appropriate. So we're going to have the preclinical animal models first, adult studies next, and then older children before you get down to infants. So the idea is that you're exposing risk to a less vulnerable population, and you continue to go down in age as necessary. Also, that risks are minimized by using the safest procedures consistent with research design. So this is emphasized here because we're going to say that children are a little vulnerable, but I will tell you that risks are also minimized in the same manner in research design with adults. But again, this is just emphasizing that everything has to be done to minimize risk. Also, that the privacy of participants and the confidentiality of data is ensured. And again, this is also a requirement with adult research, but it bears repeating. And then the IRB has to determine last that equitable selection methods exist. And again, this is back to that concept of justice, that you're asking for the burden of research to be shared in a fair manner. So here are the references. You know I like questions, so please consider dropping me a line or calling me if you have any questions, and I look forward to talking to you soon.